All right, so here's the thing. So we're going to talk about 15 features of the DSLR, and I did base this on the last presentation I did here a couple months ago, which was the 15 features of Photoshop that everybody should know, and that's gone nuts on their YouTube channel. So I thought, well, how do we follow up on that? And I thought, it's interesting that as we shoot, there's certain features that we can't think about, we have to just know inherently as we're shooting. So my first slide actually, first slide just says who I am and where I am. By the way, I'm Jeff Cable, and I've been shooting for, I don't know, almost 10 years now, and I do it because I love it. It's a lot of fun. And this is my blog, which I do, I try to blog every week. Blogged this morning. It had been about almost 2 weeks, so I'm a little remiss there. And my Facebook page and my website, so you can find me there. So here's the thing. A good photographer, and this doesn't, when I use the word photographer, it doesn't have to be professional photographer. It just means anybody who wants to take a good photo. But anybody who wants to take a good photo should be able to walk into any environment, room, whatever it might be, and know how to take a good picture. And this is a challenge because in my case, I'll be outside at midnight, pitch black, or if you're Times Square, it's pitch black behind it and you've got these bright lights in front of you. You can walk into a room where there's a wedding or a bar mitzvah and it's like different lighting every time. Might be a kid's birthday party, something in the backyard. You have to know everywhere you are how to adjust your camera to get the best shot possible in that environment. That's kind of what I'm trying to get today, is those things that we use to get the best images. So one of the previous presentations I did, we talked about the basics of photography, like finding good light and so forth, and that of course always holds true. But for those of you who are using SLRs, and many people use them, they buy these great SLRs and they leave them in automatic mode. So it's like having a really expensive point and shoot camera. So we want to learn how to use it and control it. That is what we're going to talk about today. So what are the 15 things? We're going to start with shooting modes. Some of these are going to be fairly basic for some of you and some not. Of course, the most basic one would be how to turn on your camera, but hopefully you guys all know that. And of course, you could also do RTFM, which is read the manual, which most people don't. I'll be honest with you, I shoot with the 5D Mark III and the Canon 1DX. I don't think I've ever read the manuals cover to cover, although when I get them brand new, I tend to scan through them and see what's different. But they're kind of dry, right? And so the goal is to try to explain it a little differently here, show you a lot of photos as examples of what we're shooting and how we're making adjustments. So this one here talks about the different shooting modes. And I'm one of those guys, I stay in aperture priority probably 95% of the time. And I rarely shoot in shutter priority. Once in a while I do, but not usually, because usually I'm controlling my aperture and I'm looking at my shutter speed, because you guys know they're pretty much inverse of each other, right? So if I go to a low aperture, like if I go to f16, my shutter speed is going to drop. If I go to f2.8, my shutter speed goes up. So I'm watching that, but I'm going to show you images explaining why I make choices that I do. Manual mode, which there are times when you want to use manual mode. There are times that I'll show you here where aperture priority or shutter priority just doesn't work. And manual mode is a little bit more daunting to the new shooter because you're controlling everything. The nice thing about aperture priority is you control the aperture and the camera kind of figures the rest out for you. So I'm going to show you some examples of where I'm shooting. This shot here is from the Summer Olympics. And I shot this, this is one of the rare shots where I will shoot in shutter priority, and I'm determining that I want a slow shutter so I can get motion in their legs. So I'll go to shutter priority and say, okay, shoot at 50th of a second and pan with them. In this case here, I was shooting in aperture priority, and I'm watching the shutter speed in that case because I really want some motion in the wings, but I also want a fast enough shutter speed to make sure that the bird is crisp and that everything's in focus. So I'm thinking as I'm shooting, even though I'm controlling the aperture to determine my depth of field, I'm always watching the shutter speed on the left to see, is it kind of what I want? And that's kind of learned. If you haven't shot watching that shutter speed, it takes a little bit of doing. So if you go out here to Times Square and you want to shoot and get motion of the taxi cabs going by, and you're on a tripod, you could just experiment. Shoot at 1/10 of a second, shoot at 3 seconds, shoot at 5 seconds, 10 seconds, half a second. And look and watch the difference in how much the streaks are at night with the lights going by. And you'll see those differences. And then you'll start kind of manipulating. And of course, it depends on how fast the taxis drive. Of course, it's New York, so they're usually doing about what, 200 or 300 miles an hour through Times Square. But depending how fast they're going, determines how much blur you're gonna get. So you wanna kind of play around with that. Same thing with fast action. If you're shooting birds and you're trying it, you look at the back of your camera and say, whoa, they're all out of focus. Maybe I should get a little faster shutter speed. So you kind of play around with it. This one here, I shot for an ad, and this one was shot, again, aperture priority, but really watching that shutter speed. So I think I was like at f/22 or something to really give me a narrow aperture and give me a longer shutter speed. And you could tell by the starburst in the motorcycle there, that's what you get when you're shooting at f/16, f/18, f/22. You get starbursts from lights. So if you're doing night shooting and you want that effect, you could shoot at f/16 or something like that and get that look. But I'm always thinking about how much motion and how much depth of field I want. This is a shot I grabbed off my blog because I forgot to bring it with me, so my logo's on there. But this shot I just took on, I think it was Sunday night. And you can't shoot this in aperture priority because the camera looks and says, oh, it's really dark. I better make it really bright. And what happens is the leaves then, which looks better on these screens here, you can see the leaves of the tree in my backyard, those will become much brighter so you can actually see them, because really it wasn't that dark. It was still fairly light. The moon just happened to come out at the right time. But the camera, if it lit up the leaves and made them right, that moon would be like a glowing white orb. You wouldn't even know it's the moon. It would look like a street light or like someone's pointing a flashlight at you. So you have to shoot in manual mode. And what I do is I'll shoot one image at aperture priority if you're just learning and say, okay, the camera was at f/250th at 100th of a second. Well, that didn't work. So let me try, instead of 100th of a second, let me try 500th of a second. And then I'll look at the back of the LCD and go, oh, now I can see the moon. Or maybe the moon's too dark. Maybe I'll try 300th of a second or 4. So you kind of experiment. But in this case, there's no way that you can shoot any kind of picture of the moon or even sometimes good sunsets without going into manual mode. So, like I said, I tend to stay in aperture priority most of the time. And when you're shooting in aperture priority, you want to think about how it affects your composition. What do you want to be in focus? What do you not want in focus? Or do you want everything in focus? And that's going to determine what your aperture is going to be. And we're going to talk about, I'll show you some images. So you want to determine your depth of field and how much separation you want. So if I'm photographing a model and I have something ugly behind her, like just maybe some trees where the leaves are all brown, it's not really working for me, then I'll shoot it really wide, maybe f/2.8 or f/4 or whatever I can get. So I can create separation, and I'll move that person away from the background so I create separation and get more depth, the depth of field I want. And other times, depending on if I want everything in focus, because they're standing, there's a photo in China where I wanted to show the background behind the kid, which you'll see. So I'm shooting at f/8 or f/10 or f/16 to include the background. Hopefully that's all making sense. Are we making sense? All right. So you want to know, again, as I mentioned before, you want to know how that affects your shutter speed. Because if I say, gee, I want everything in focus, and maybe it's kind of dusk, and I'm in Yosemite, well, at f/16, I may be shooting at half a second. Well, if I'm handheld, that's not going to work very well. So shoot in aperture priority and learn how to control the depth of field, but watch that number to the left. And the rule of thumb is make sure that your shutter speed is at least equivalent to your focal length. Which means if I'm shooting with a 200 millimeter lens, my shutter speed should probably be 200th of a second to be in focus, unless you're really good. Or if you're like me and you drink lots of Diet Coke, or if you don't, you get the shakes, maybe 5,000th of a second. But try to keep it to the same as your focal length. So easier with a wide angle lens. If you're shooting with a 18 millimeter lens, it tends to be easier. If you're shooting 100th of a second, it's gonna be fine. If you're shooting with a 500 millimeter lens, then it's tough, because you want to be at least 500th of a second, if not faster, to get it in focus. You want to know how to direct the focus of your viewer. So the lesson I always teach, and I just did this for those who read my blog, a friend of mine who has cancer, a neighbor of ours grew up across the street from us. He's now feeling better, and I promised him we'd take him out and go shooting. And he's got a Nikon D800, and I said, we're going to go out and have some fun. So we went around San Francisco and we shot. And I was explaining to him depth of field and aperture priority, and I said, this is the thing I do with everybody. Point your finger at me. So he did. And I focused on his eyes. So that's what you're seeing there. And then I refocused on his finger. Okay? So I'm going to go back and forth for a second. I'm determining what the viewer is looking at with that image. And this is something especially for new shooters, when you shoot in aperture priority and you shoot at the lowest number possible, the highest aperture, then you can get this kind of separation, and it's really exciting the first time you do it, when you get like the flowers perfectly in focus and everything else not. You're starting to control the camera versus the camera controlling you. So that's my lesson. And they tell a different story too. This one here is more about him. This is like he's mad at me, you know. This shot was before the Beijing Olympics. I didn't want to shoot it at f4 or f2.8 because I want to see the background. So I shot this, I think, at f8 or f11 to include everything in the background, because again, the background is part of the story of the image. This shot is in Ferndale, California. Beautiful home, amazing flowers. I went back like 3 years later and it had been sold and it was nowhere near as pretty. I didn't pump any colors in Photoshop. I used a polarizing filter. But again, I shot this at f11 because I wanted everything in focus. I want the tree in the background. I want the flowers in the foreground. I wanted everything to be sharp. This one here in the Sydney Zoo, I shot at 5.6, I believe. I wanted some of the background in focus, but I didn't want it too sharp because I want people to look at the giraffes first and then look at the background. This one I took in Toronto. This was in front of an office building. So it wasn't like I went to some amazing, place out in the wilderness and hiked for 4 hours, because I'm way too lazy to do that. This is in front of an office building, and I could have shot this at f11 and had everything in focus. I chose not to do that because I really wanted the viewer to kind of be led into the image, into the middle of the image. So if you look at the background, it's soft. And if you look at the foreground, it's soft. So it kind of draws your eye right to that middle where I want you. This shot here is a really good example of shooting an aperture priority to avoid the background. This was taken in Alaska, and I was on a cruise. So when you're on a cruise, you really weren't in Alaska, right? They dump you off and they tell you all the great stores to go to. I'm like, no thanks. But we really didn't get a chance to see Alaska, unfortunately. But we did go to this one area where they rehabilitate eagles. So the green and the blue that you see in the background, believe it or not, the blue is a blue painted plywood board. And the green was like a plant they just had in there to make it look better for those of us visiting. So I don't want you to know that that's a blue plywood plank or whatever it was, sheet, of wood. So I shot this at f2.8, fairly close to the bird, but I don't want you to see the background. It's not part of what my story would be. So we talk about aperture priority and how that how shutter speed and aperture kind of work inverse of each other. So this shot was in my backyard. I wanted aperture priority because I wanted to separate the hummingbird from the background. I wanted the flower somewhat in focus because I want you to know that it's not a feeder, it's actually a natural shot. But I also, I could have shot it at ISO 6000, 6400, and probably frozen the wings. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted some motion. So I shot this at 2.8, I think at ISO 400, and I wanted it to the point where I got some motion in the wings, but I'm not looking at what's behind it, because honestly what's behind it is a lemon tree, I think it was, or my orange tree in the back. And it was not a great looking tree. So I don't want you looking at the tree, I want you looking at the bird. So I'm watching as I'm shooting the hummingbird. I'm trying to get my focal point right on its eye, and then I'm looking at the shutter speed saying, okay, with a hummingbird, even 500th of a second, you still get blur. Now most birds at 500th of a second, you'll freeze them, but these guys are crazy fast. All right, so one of the things I mentioned was here I could have cranked up the ISO of the camera. So there's three things that work together on your cameras: your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. And those are the three things you can pretty much adjust to control your exposures and everything else. So the question is, what is the desired ISO? And I get this a lot from people. Well, it depends where you're shooting. It also depends on what camera you have. So if I'm shooting in here right now and I want to get a nice portrait and it's really dark over there in the corner, I'm gonna have to crank up my ISO really high. The challenge with that is we now inject noise into the image. It gets grainy. But when I'm shooting, even outdoors, actually everywhere I'm shooting, I'm watching that ISO to determine what I want. If I want to freeze the action, let's say I'm shooting the Olympics and I have kind of a gray day, and it's cloudy, not a lot of sun, if I need to get 1,000th of a second and I have a lens that lets me shoot at f2.8, I may have to take that ISO and keep moving it up to the point where I can get to 1,000th of a second. It may be ISO 1600, even though it's daylight outside. Now, inversely, outside right now, beautiful New York day, by the way, thank you so much, which was rare. I think last time I heard it was pouring rain, or snowing. This is much nicer. But the cool thing is, if it's that bright, we have tons of light to work with, which can be good and bad, right? If we have lots of shadows, it could be a problem, depending on what we're shooting. But I know that my ISO can then come down probably to ISO 100, and I can shoot no problem with really fast shutter speeds. So you want to be cognizant of that. So going back to the first point of this presentation where I said you want to be able to walk in to any environment and know how to shoot it. When I walk into a church or a temple and they say, let's shoot now, I have to say, okay, let's go. And I'm already in my head thinking, okay, kind of dark, probably ISO 1600, f2.8, or if I have a whole group of people, I can't get away with 2.8 because some people will be in focus, some won't. So maybe I have to be at f5.6. Okay, now I have to crank up the ISO a little bit more. So those three things I'm always in my mind. I wake up sometimes at night thinking ISOs and shutter speeds. No, I really don't. And then again, motion blur comes into that as well. So if I'm shooting night shots here in the city and I want lots of blur, even though it's really dark outside, I'll turn my ISO to 100 and I'll go f16 and all of a sudden I have a 30-second exposure. But then I get lots of the light blurs and I get the starburst effect. But if I want to shoot at f16 to get the starburst effect, but I don't want millions of cabs going through my picture, I might turn up my ISO a little bit more. Or actually a good example of that here is the Brooklyn Bridge, because the Brooklyn Bridge moves, right? So you can't really do a long exposure on the bridge because there's enough movement from the vehicles. I've tried it, it doesn't work. So if I want a decent night shot from the Brooklyn Bridge, believe it or not, I have to crank up my ISO to like 800, and I can't do a 30-second exposure, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, and you hope there's no buses coming by. So again, I'm always thinking it through and looking to see, and I feel it. If I stand somewhere, I'm like, oh, this thing's moving, this isn't gonna work. ISO goes up. The other thing is you wanna think about how much noise can you accept, okay? So on older cameras, I was just talking to someone this morning about these, and they said, well, what's the best thing that's happened in cameras in the last 5 years? It isn't megapixels. What is the average person using for megapixels today? Less than 1. Why? Because they're going on Facebook and Instagram, and they're probably not even half a megapixel, right? They're like this big. So megapixels doesn't interest me as much as be able to shoot in low light and be able to shoot and get a nice shot even at ISO 6000. So older cameras couldn't do that and the newer ones can, and I've got an image to show you kind of a comparison even in the last couple of years. But If you're okay with a little bit of grain, that's fine. And if I want to take a portrait of you back there in the dark and I have no flash with me, then that's what I have to do to get the picture. I'm okay with that. It's better than not getting the picture. And one of my favorite shots to do, which I don't have in here, is to do candlelight shots with no flash and just have the kid blow out their birthday candles. I think that's cool because they're lit by the candles and there's nothing else. Okay, fine. Maybe I have to go to ISO 3000, 3200, 4000, whatever. But it's going to look nice and I can get rid of some of that noise in Lightroom or Photoshop by just pulling the luminance slider. And if you guys aren't familiar with that, if you look at the last presentation I did here, the 15 features of Photoshop that you should know, I talk about that. And you can get rid of that noise pretty easily. But at least you can get the shot. Better to get it in focus and have some grain than out of focus and it's a throwaway shot, okay? So what can your camera handle? And this is the question when people say to me, like, should I shoot at ISO 6000? First question I ask them, what camera do you have? And if it's a camera that you purchased in the last year or two, maybe. If you have an old digital Rebel or Canon 30D or Nikon D70, no. No way. So here's my comparison of a 5D Mark II, which is not that old, and a 5D Mark III at ISO 6400. And I don't know if you can see it on these screens here, but it's pretty dramatic difference in the quality of the colors and the noise, I mean, just in those two cameras being a couple of years apart, 2 or 3 years apart. And I have no problem. I shot a bar mitzvah last Saturday, and I shot images at ISO 10,000 because I didn't want to use a flash. I wanted to use ambient light in the shot, and they looked really good. The family loved them. Now, if I zoom in, do I see a little bit of grain in there? Yeah. Do you think the family goes, oh, that one's kind of grainy? No, they love it. It has a different look to it. So again, the newer cameras can handle that. Shooting modes, I had to put Lexar product in there. How to put that in there. So when I do shoot, I almost never have it in a single shot mode. I'm always in continuous shooting. And here's the thing, if you want to shoot one shot of somebody, just press it quickly. The advantage of shooting in burst mode is, and I almost always shoot at least 3 or 4 frames of everything, because if you're shooting with people, you will get someone to blinks, or someone who has that weird expression for half a second, or I had this one on Saturday, the uncle kept looking this way for some reason, and he turned back at me and he kept, I don't know what he was doing. But, so 3 of my images had him right, and the other 6 were this way, but I'm always in continuous mode. And I leave it that way. Now, on a 1DX, which I also shoot with, which shoots, was it 14 frames a second? No. That's a little daunting. Oh, hi, let me take your picture. You'll be like, ah! I don't do that. Although for sports, if I'm shooting hockey and stuff, I'll do that. But for portraits, not a chance. That would be freaky. But I keep it in this slower continuous mode, which instead of 14 frames a second, I think is like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever. And that's great. That works. Yeah, don't scare your people when you're shooting them. So always in continuous mode. The reason I have the 1000X card in there is the one advantage of shooting continuous mode is you can get lots of good shots and get the one and pick the one you like. But it does tend to fill your buffer more. And so I do use the fastest memory cards possible so I can get the images off the buffer to the card and keep moving. All right, so here's a good example of continuous mode shooting. And I was shooting this at 12 frames a second, give or take. And you know, could I have timed it perfectly? Yeah, maybe. Giving myself more credit probably than I deserve. But you know, the great thing about shooting in burst mode is I can get it right at that peak. Because I'm shooting enough images, I can go, no, yes. That's the one I want. So, and it's not just for sports. I mean, honestly, even shooting at the Grand Ole Opry House, I shot in continuous mode there, and it's amazing the difference between an expression half a second apart. And it may be that eyes are open, but just a little different look, or maybe the bow with the strings that were breaking just happened to be a little bit more in view on that shot. Focus modes. All right, now we're getting a little bit more intricate here, and we're going to talk about back focusing in a minute. I don't use AI servo. I don't use there's AI servo and there's fixed focus on the Canon cameras. There's also one in the middle, and I forget what the heck they call it. By the way, I should mention, everything I'm talking about here, I tend to have images here from Canon because I'm a Canon shooter, but this all pretty much holds true. Every one of these holds true for Nikon, Canon, Olympus, Sony, whatever you're shooting with. The two modes I use are fixed focus and what they call servo focus, or what's follow focus. You really, really want to know the difference between those two and when to use them, which we're going to talk about. So one, is your subject moving? Okay, and if they are moving, how are they moving? So if you're in the back of the room and you want to photograph me right now, I would actually say fixed focus is what you need because you can lock focus on me. I'm not really moving too much here. If I was doing this back and forth, that's going to be a problem. But if I'm kind of at one plane from you, you could do a fixed focus. Or if I'm moving this way, back and forth, which I tend to do, you're still okay if you're in the back of the room there in fixed focus. If I start moving down the aisle to and from you, all of a sudden that's going to be really tough. And now you want to be in continuous modes. So when I'm shooting sports, I'm thinking about what sport I'm shooting and where are they moving to determine if I need that. And the other thing is, I do think about, can I follow the action? There are times when people are moving to and from me at a fairly slow rate where I can actually recompose and shoot and probably get them. Okay? When I'm shooting portraits, I don't shoot in a follow or servo focus because frankly, I don't want it drifting on me. I want to lock in the focus on her eye and shoot the image. I don't want it going off in different directions. So I do fixed focus, lock on the eye, and shoot. This is a senior portrait I just did a couple weeks ago. Now, in this case, in the Olympics, when they're coming down in their kayaks, they're moving fairly quickly toward me as they're going through the gates, and they're moving toward me. I'm not going to be able to sit there and refocus every time, so I let the camera do it for me. So I'm in a servo focus, generally center point turned on. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And I just follow them as they're coming toward me and fire off. And I let the camera do the work for me. And most of the time, it's pretty close to dead on. I will mention that newer cameras also have faster and better focusing than some of the older cameras as well. This one here, this is sports, but guess what? I didn't shoot it in servo focus, I shot it in a fixed focus. Why? Because the fencers aren't moving, they're moving forward, backward, they're not moving across the other plane. So they're generally all about the same distance from me all the time, because I'm on the side shooting them. So I actually shot this in a fixed focus mode, knowing that they weren't going to be coming to and from me. I also shot it at an aperture that was really wide. Probably, I think it was a shot at f2.8, pretty sure, so that I didn't see the crowd behind the fencer. Again, I want you to look at the fencer, not be distracted by all the people picking their nose in the background. Now, this sport, try to shoot this one with fixed focus, forget it. These girls are moving on this balance beam to and from me. So here, I'm servo focus, locking in on the eye. I've got my point now move, which we're going to talk about, to the upper section of my camera so that the focal point is right on her face so I can get her eyes wide open looking at me. Because generally, with good photos, if the eyes are in focus, it's a good shot. If I had messed up the shot and focused on her feet, this is a throwaway. So, focus modes. Single point or spectrum. Now I've got here different kinds of spectrums. I didn't do a single point, but I grabbed this off Canon's website. But a single point would be turning on just one particular dot here. And I generally shoot in a single point mode most of the time. I would say probably 95% of the time. Unless I'm shooting, the Olympics is different because the action is so fast because they're such amazing athletes. That sometimes I'll go into a spectrum to give myself a little bit more leeway, depending on the sport. But there are different modes and different times you want to use these. Like I said, the spectrum is good if you don't think you can lock in on their eyes with one small point. Give yourself some leeway and go to a wider spectrum. And different cameras handle this differently. So an older camera may just give you 9 points of focus and that's what you get. Some of the newer, more advanced cameras, like the 1DX actually has way more points and you could just you can go into clusters wherever you want, which is an advantage for that camera. But you want to at least know that you can do this in certain respects. The one thing that we do, especially at the Olympics, is what we call back focusing. This confuses a lot of people when I say back focusing. It's not all that confusing, so we're going to talk about it a little bit here. What back focusing is it's turning off your shutter button so it does not focus at all. It's a great technique, and I'll explain why. Basically, it gives you control in certain environments where things either are moving really fast or are not moving at all, which we'll talk about in a sec. And it gives you amazing control, because sometimes when you hit that shutter button, you don't want it to focus, because you may have, you may be pointing something off. If you've got center dot turned on, and let's say you're taking a picture off center, well, you don't want it to focus center, and then your model or your subject is off to the right. Now all of a sudden you're drifting, and they're gonna be out of focus. So in sports, because we're focusing on action, we tend to back focus. And what that means is, and again, this is true for almost all cameras, but in this case, it's a Canon menu. I go to, on the 5D Mark III, I go to Custom Controls, and this is something you can look in your manual, how to do this. And I turn the shutter button, and I turn off the AF, and I turn it to just metering. So the button is still taking the photo, but it doesn't focus anymore. And what I do is I now create a different button on the camera which focuses, which I have here in a second. I'll show you. So what that means is, when I'm shooting a sport like water polo, I knew in this case that the shot clock was ticking down, and I knew that the goaltender was about to make a play. So what I did is I back focus on the goaltender's face, so that it was locked in, my focus was tight, I was ready to go. And then I let go of that button, and now I don't have to worry about the camera focusing anything. I already told the camera, okay, focus here, good. Now, would it work if the goalie were to come out 5 feet from the net? That would be a problem. Then I'd hit the back focus again, recompose that focus. But in this case, they don't move that much. I'm probably 100 feet away from the guy. I do my focus, now it's one less thing for me to worry about. Now, if this guy here became the center of action, then there's a problem. I have to quickly go and hit the button again and refocus. So I mentioned how we get there. So what I do, actually, sorry, different slide. I'll come back to it in a second. It's a perfect way for getting things more in control of our focus. We use it a lot for like diving at the Olympics, because again, they're just straight distance from us across the plane. So they'll go up to the diving board, they'll get ready, they do their prep, I back focus on their face, let go, and now I can just get them on the whole dive. They're not diving toward me, trust me. That would be dangerous, wouldn't it? So they're just one plane, I'm following them and shooting. Lots of non-sports scenarios. I have a picture I'll show you in a second of that. The bad part about back focusing is one more finger to think about. It's one more button. So it's a little weird at first when you do it, because now you're not just doing this, you're doing this kind of with two fingers. Focus, focus, shoot, sometimes at the same time. So it's takes a little bit to get used to. Once you do it, it's cool. So here's an example of a non-sports mode where I use this quite a bit. I do shoot a lot of bar mitzvahs, as we've talked about in the past. So here's the thing. They're up there at the bima and they're doing their thing. But again, they're not moving too far forward or backward, because they're behind this thing and they're generally reading from that same area. So what I do is I'll then get my camera locked and I'll fine tune it to make sure I'm perfectly in focus. Then I don't have to worry about the button, because I already know it's locked in. And the only time I'll reposition that focus is if I see, if the family comes up and now there's a large group and they've moved back, now I need to recompose. Other than that, if the kid's reading for half an hour, I'm not focusing at all. Does that make sense? Got that? So I use it quite a bit in this scenario. Again, not sports, but it's a great way. But here's the tricky part. If you do this, you better make darn sure you're in focus, or you'll have 30 minutes of junk, right? So you want to make sure that you're really tight. And I'm going to talk about a little trick on how to do that in a minute. So back focus, this is the slide I was thinking about. So for back focus, this is where on the Canon, they have this AF on button, and you can select which button you want. That's the one it defaults to, that's the one I like. So I just use this AF on button, and it's nice because my thumb is perfectly fits there. So I can just do this and use 2 fingers and choose if I want to shoot or focus as I'm going. So this is a case we actually may have to pick up the manual and read it. But try it. It's a great way to, it's really the equivalent of like having your autofocus on your lens turned on and then flipping the switch on your lens to manual focus. It just turns it off, but that's kind of a pain. I've done that too. This is an important one. This is my biggest pet peeve, by the way, of all the camera manufacturers. Change the factory setting. Most of the digital SLRs that ship, they have the entire spectrum on, which means you buy your camera, you charge your battery, you pop it in, you go to take your first picture, and I'm pointing at this crowd, and 4 lights light up, beep, 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 beep. So the camera goes, oh, I think you want to focus on these 2 and him. Really? Everything we just talked about was, I want to control the focus because I want to control what the viewer is looking at. That is horrible, in my opinion, humble opinion. Change that. So the first thing I always do when someone gives me their camera is I turn that off and I put it to center point. I tell them, just go with center point focus. Most people tend to center most of their images. But learn how to change that if you're shooting portrait or landscape. If I'm shooting landscape, center point many times works fine. Click, 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 good. But if I'm shooting portrait mode, now I'm centered on their belly button versus their eyes. We have a problem. Learn how to move that point to the top of your spectrum. So from the middle to the top, and that way it's locked in at the top where you want it. The thing is, you want to learn how to do this so that it's instinctively done. I'll show you here. This shot, during bar mitzvahs, almost every temple does this. During the service, there's a point to where the kid gets the Torah and they walk through the temple. Now I'm in the back on a tripod shooting, but at this point, I grab my other camera and I get into the aisle, which many times you're not allowed to. You're supposed to be there, like during the service, they don't want you there. But for a split second, when they're walking with the Torah, I'll go there. I'm in follow focus because they're walking toward me. I know they're not going to be standing. So I've already got the camera preset. Follow focus, ISO cranked up because I'm handheld. So I'll probably be at ISO 3200 if it's a fairly dark temple. I'm turned and I'm shooting portrait, up and down, and my focal point is right on her face. I've moved that point to the top of my spectrum. I know that I'm going to be shooting this way, and I know that she's about 5 feet tall or whatever. That's where I want it. If it's still center point focused, like I said, I'll be focusing on the Torah and not her eyes. Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you. Same thing here with our friend the gecko. I saw this guy was like 3 inches long. It was really tiny. I happened to bring a macro lens with me to Hawaii. And again, if I had shot it this way, landscape, I probably could have kept it center focused or center point. But I knew that I wanted to include the shadow underneath the leaf. And I knew I'd be shooting in portrait mode. Again, quickly, he wasn't going anywhere. Thankfully, he stuck around for a while. So I quickly moved the point, turned, and shot it. Now this one here is just the opposite. This one is center point because I know that I want them at the very front to be in focus. They're the important part of this. So I shot with a fisheye lens here, focused right dead center, and grabbed it. This one here, a little different. For this shot, I actually moved my focal point to the Olympic rings kind of top right. I did that for 2 reasons. One is when you're at the Olympics, you want people to know you're at the Olympics. So I try to include the rings as much as I can. But I did it because that's really, I knew I was shooting it at like f/16, things would be pretty much in focus across the board anyway. But that's what I was locking in on at that time. This next shot was a really tricky one. This was the US Olympic gymnastic trials. And again, these guys are amazing. Look at the muscular tone on those arms, just like mine. Yeah, all of ours, right? Yeah, we all look like that. So the tricky part of this shot was I knew when he's on the rings what I wanted, which is I wanted his face in focus, but I didn't have much face to work with there, right? So luckily here I was not center focused. I actually had moved that focal point down, so it was south of center. So that if you look at the shot, his feet are soft, his hands are a little soft, and I'm dead in right on his face. A little bit of luck, but a little bit of planning too. And like I said, it was really tough because that focal, that single point had to be right there to get it. I probably had a couple that drifted to it, before and after this shot. Exposure, how many people here have used exposure compensation? Good, all right. A lot of people look at me and they go, what? Exposure comp is something I don't use all the time, but there's definitely times where you want to use exposure compensation. I tend to find that the DSLRs today tend to overcompensate themselves in either direction. So where I love doing night photography, there's a shot I did in China last year. And what I find is if I shot this without exposure comp, everything that's lit, the lanterns and stuff, would just be like beacons of light. Because what happens is the camera goes, oh gosh, night scene, really dark, help, better go bright. And if you pull it into Photoshop and you hit auto, it'll do the same thing, like, ah, and then everything's like perfectly bright, and you can see the tiles in the roof, and it's a horrible image. So what I do is when it's dark, I'll go darker. So I'll actually go minus comp. I'll go about -1 stop of exposure compensation. So I'm telling the camera, I know you think it's kind of dark, but I like it that way, and let's go that way. So, so I do go darker. Same thing, I tried this shot in Paris without using exposure compensation, and the Eiffel Tower was almost invisible because it was so lit. So I shot it, again, about -1 stop. The other advantage of shooting -1 stop, if I go back here, see how nice and blue the sky is? By the way, China, it's so gray because of pollution that shooting at night is the best time to shoot there. One of the other presentations I did, I used this image and I showed the daytime shot of this. Trust me, night looks way prettier. Actually, the mood of the shot, I love shooting at night just because the moods, it's just great. This particular shot, though, like I said, it's both of these, you get this deep blue sky. So when I shot this, if I'm at -1, it probably wasn't that dark yet. And here's what happens. When it gets really dark at night, that means you have more differential between the really bright and a black sky. So I actually prefer to shoot when it's not completely black yet, and then you get these deep blue skies. So really, it was probably a lot lighter than that. But because I'm darkening it down, I'm saying, good, I'm gonna bring everything darker. The Eiffel Tower is darker, the sky is darker, and then you get this beautiful blue sky. So try that. Actually, I did a presentation here on how to shoot at night, so that's on YouTube as well. Compensation in the other direction. If you're shooting in the snow, you actually want to go the other direction, because now your camera's going, bright white, don't go into the light, it's freaking out, and it goes, okay, better get dark, and now your snow gets this really nasty, ugly gray. So most photographers who shoot in the snow or skiing, stuff like that, will go +1, sometimes even +2, to be able to make your snow white again. Because again, the camera is overcompensating and freaking out with so much white. So we're actually going +1 in this case. White balance. I generally shoot in auto white balance. How about that? And the reason is I shoot everything raw, and if I need to adjust it later, I can. There are times when I don't do that, but you want to know how to do a custom white balance, because there are certain environments you're going to shoot in where it means you have to come home and adjust hundreds or thousands of images. So you want to know how to do this, and most cameras, what you do is you tell your camera, go into auto white balance mode, and then the camera will say, take a picture please and show me what is white. So you can use like an expo disc, which is what I have, or you find someone like her who's got a white shirt and say, turn around for a second, and bam, and shoot a picture of their shirt. Or if someone happens to wear an 18% gray shirt, that's even better. But really, honestly, if I'm shooting ice hockey, which I think is the next image, there, I'll white balance off the ice if I need to. And what happens is if you don't white balance, everything's going to be really yellow here. So I don't auto white balance. I use auto white balance a lot of the times, but in environments like this, I will not. I'll preset the camera for what's correct and shoot them all correct. Same thing with that shot. Two different venues. The men played in one venue, the women played in another. Totally different white balance settings. Although the Olympics is cheating because it's so well lit for the TV cameras that it makes it easier for us. You walk into a typical gymnasium where like my son used to play basketball. Oh God, it was horrendous. And and people show me, look at this shot of my son. I'm like, oh, it's really nice. Is your son really like sick, or like because he's like really yellow? And honestly, even though I white balance these shots, I still tweaked them a bit in Photoshop before I delivered them to the team. I didn't get it perfect. Highlight control. How many people here use blinkies? That's it? Oh, people, bad. This is a great feature on these cameras. This has been around for a long time. Highlight alert. And what this is when you're shooting, if it overexposes, you get the blinkies. And the camera's going, no, 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 bad. Don't do this. Of course, it depends what's blinking. If I'm shooting a model and I don't care about the sky behind her and I don't care if it's blown out, as long as she's not blinking, I'm okay with that. But if you're shooting the bride at the wedding and she has this beautiful veiling dress and you shoot it and it's all blinking, guess what? Her dress is gonna be really white, like Clorox white. It means there's no data. You will not see a fold, you will not see the detail in the dress, nothing. So what you want to do is turn on highlight alerts, and when you're shooting, if you see them on a part you care about, maybe use exposure comp and bring it down half a stop and try again. Because here's the thing, easier to shoot in that mode and get it a little bit dark and brighten her dress than have no data at all and be toast, okay? So again, I use the blinkies to say, is there anything blinking I care about? And there are times when I shoot when, like if the ice on those previous images was blinking, let me go back for a second to that. If the ice was blinking here, you wouldn't see all the details in the rink. Maybe I don't care. The one before it is a little brighter. Would I, yeah, I could probably bring it back a little bit. But here, I don't want this to be pure white. So I'm watching that to avoid the blinks where I don't need them. So enable blinkies. The only time I turn those off, honestly, is if I'm shooting and I'm showing the customer what I got. If I'm shooting portraits, you saw the senior portraits I did of Jessica earlier. Her mom was with me and I was putting her to work. Here, hold this reflector, do this. And my wife was with me as well. And I was showing them like, here's what we're getting right now. Which, by the way, as a photographer, I love doing that because it puts the kid at ease. Oh, wow, I actually look good there. And then you gain their trust for shooting the rest of the day. But when you show it to them and things are blinking, it freaks them out. Like, am I about to explode? So I turn off the blinkies when I show it to them. And sometimes I'll turn it back on. Usually I kind of can tell now, I'm shooting long enough, I pretty much don't need it as much. But I still like to leave it on because there are times when I go, whoops, I'm getting blinking in her face. That's bad. Okay? So turn that on. Oops. SS. That's my code for put some text here, which I didn't. Huh. How about that? Okay. Should we put text there? Let's just talk about it instead. That's funny. There's different metering modes. I almost always leave mine on evaluative metering, depending on what I'm shooting. Most of the time, I leave it on evaluative metering. And what that means is, like you can see with this graphic here, evaluative metering means look at the whole scene and the camera's going to try to meter for it. Now, where that doesn't work is in certain environments where you know that something's really dark in the background or really bright in the background, and you want the camera just to focus on or meter on a certain thing, you can then go to like spot metering, which is just going to meter in one area. I generally don't use that very often. I have a trick for that, which I'll tell you in a second. In this case, with John Legend concert, if I had done evaluative metering, it would have been all over the place because the light changes every couple seconds. They go blue lights, white lights, red lights, light on his face, no light on his face, light on the drummer, and it's like, ah. So when I shoot concerts, I generally use spot metering. Why? Because I'm saying, meter on his face, I don't care about the rest. Let it blow out. Let this be really, really bright, I don't care. Same thing with this shot in the Eagles concert. Those lights were changing even faster. And so what I said to the cameras, spot meter on them. Don't worry about the rest. Let it go really black, let it go really light, and just meter off of them. And I got lucky because I shot this at a time where the lights were just perfectly framing them, and it worked. So, some of this is just luck, too. But it worked. And if I had done evaluative metering, it would have looked at all those lights and said, oh, really bright, and they'd be invisible. So here's a trick, by the way, if you want to get really fancy. This gets a little tricky, but oh well. I rarely use spot metering because I use the metering button, almost like back focusing, I use a back metering button. So on a lot of the cameras, they have a metering button. So what I would do is, I would say, okay, I'll point into the lights and say, meter, or in this case, I'd point at them, hit the metering button, then I could zoom out wide and fire, and it's going to go off of what I just clicked on. So in the case of, let's see if I can make sense of this here. If I'm shooting that wide, that fisheye shot I showed you, the temple, that one there, because there are windows all around that temple, if I shoot it, the camera's going, okay, lots of bright lights all around me here, so I better go really dark. So if I shoot it straight on like I did, everything's really dark. So what I do is I take the camera and I point it down a little bit so it doesn't see all the windows. I hit the metering button, I come back up, and then this button's still focusing, I'm not back focusing, and I shoot it. So I meter down a little bit, come up and I fire. This takes a little bit of practice, because here's the thing, if I were to point down at the floor and meter and come back up and shoot, it's gonna be like the sun. And if I go toward the windows, it's gonna be the opposite, it'll be black when I shoot. So what I do is I go down about maybe 10 or 15%, hit the metering button, come back up and shoot, and it's amazing. The reason I do that is because then I don't have to sit there and go like this and change the settings of the camera and come back up. I just wasted time. And if I've got a model or a wedding and they're walking toward me, I don't have time to sit there and muck with it. So it's like boom, boom. So I'll just do a quick remeter and fire. I don't know if you guys know who Joe Busink is. He's an amazing wedding photographer. He taught me that trick. Kudos to Joe. Live view. This one gets a little bit Canon specific. For cameras that do have live view, this is the coolest thing. Live view means that you're not looking through your eyepiece, you're actually looking at the LCD on the back of the camera, and it's showing you what's up for shooting. A couple of advantages of live view. One is on most cameras, when they go to live view, the mirror then goes out of the way. So when you fire, it's quieter, which is kind of cool. It's also nice for framing. When I do night shots a lot of times, it's a double bonus being in live view, because one, I'm seeing on the LCD what I'm gonna get, but also it's locked the mirror, so it's less motion in the camera, injecting possible shake during a long exposure. Does that make sense? So I love that, but I'll tell you what I really love about live view is the ability to do fine focus. So what I do, that shot that you saw before in the temple, where it was the rabbi and the kid, and I said they're pretty much in the same spot, and I told you I got in really tight to make sure it was fine, really good focus, and then I can leave it. So here's what I do. I'm in back focus mode, and I go into live view, and one of the cool things about the Canon camera with live view is I can go and I can hit the magnification button, and I can zoom in, 10x. So check this out. When I did that Eiffel Tower picture, I was into one of those girders on the Eiffel Tower. That's how tight I was. Even though I was, I don't know, quarter mile away, I would frame it and focus it the way I wanted. Then I'd zoom with my lens all the way in, and then I'd use the 10x live view zoom. And I'm looking at people on the Eiffel Tower, and I'm manually focusing it and going there, right there. Now I can zoom back out, and I'm like tack sharp every time. Same thing in the bar mitzvah, the wedding. If I'm in the back on a tripod, I'll go right into their eyelashes. And I focus on their eyelashes, and then I come back out. And again, as long as they're not moving too much in either direction, I do have some kids that do like, stop, and super glue their feet to the ground. But if they're pretty much there, and you lock in right on their eyes, I mean, literally, I've had people, like videographers, look at me like, "What are you doing?" Like, whoa, like, because I'm watching their eyes blink. And the other thing that's great about that is sometimes I won't use 10x, sometimes I'll use the 5x. And what I'm doing is I'm just isolating the kid, and I'm watching from way back behind the back of a large temple, and I'm looking at their facial expressions. I've already got 20 pictures of them reading. I don't care about those. Boom, the kid breaks into a big smile or looks at mom with a great look, bam. But I'm zoomed in, I'm looking like at every little expression. It's a great technique. So that's the live view. The other thing is, I learned this in Beijing at the Olympics when we were shooting the bird's nest at opening ceremonies. A guy from Canon was standing next to me, and Jerry was the one who said, "Hey, check this out," and showed me that. And if you want the perfect focus, there's no better way to get it than that. Okay, stay in your seats. This gets scary. Flash. I said the word flash. How many people here feel like they have 100% knowledge of their flash? That's kind of what I expected. None of us do. Flash is scary. Scarier than a lot of the camera stuff. And I was trying to decide, like, should I put this in this presentation? Because it isn't really a DSLR feature. But I thought, you know what, people need to know this, so we threw it in. And it is actually part of the camera, because the Canon cameras now, and I think the Nikons, you can control the flash from the menus of the camera, which is cool. But you want to know when to use a flash and when not to use a flash, and that's really important for getting a good image. And I'll show you some examples here of how I do it, but there's times when you want to use a flash indoors, there's times you don't want to use a flash indoors. There's times outdoors where you don't want to use a flash, and there's times when you do. So I want to show you some different ways that I do that. But you want to be able to control your flash output. How many people here know how to turn down their flash? Okay. Check your manual and learn that, because here's the thing, it's usually not very difficult. But when I shoot all of my senior portraits and everything else you're seeing here, I turn my flash down usually at least one stop down, sometimes two. Because they tend to overpower, they tend to overcompensate, and you get this really flash look. I don't like that. I want a little bit of subtle flash to get rid of any shadows and get the catch light in their eyes, but I don't want to overpower it. So you want to learn how to control your flash. You can do that from your flash and many times from the camera. The newer cameras have it in their own menus. Okay. And sometimes you can even use additional flashes. This gets a little tricky. The new Canon 600 FX, was it EX RTs? They have radio transmitters built into them. They are so cool. So now I'm using, I didn't used to, now I'm using like 3 or 4 flashes when I shoot an event. And I'm actually turning on different ones from my camera as I'm shooting, which I'll show you. So this shot here, this is actually shot in a temple, and I used a flash, but if you look at the photo, you'll see that half of her face is lit and half is in shadow, giving me a little bit of dimension. How did I do that? I pointed at the wall. There was a white wall to my right. So I held the camera with my flash pointing to the wall and bounced and used the wall basically as a giant window coming back at her. If I had shot this with a flash right at her, which I could have, diffused or not, there would have been no dimension. I love this picture. I shot that at f1.4 and completely blurred the background. She was so cute. I've never put a kid up on the Beamer before, but she was adorable. And just like, couldn't help myself. So flash pointed at a wall. This is my sister and her husband at their wedding. I shot her. The great thing about being a photographer is you could do this. The bad thing is you do this. You get invited to every good party, don't you? Like, hey, like they'll call my wife, hey, can you guys come to this party? Can Jeff bring his gear, you know? But it was really fun to do. And I don't know if I could actually sit through a wedding without shooting because I'm so used to doing it. So I shot a wedding. But so in this particular moment, the sun was dropping. I looked outside and saw this cool sunset on the clouds, and I go to my sister, like, you gotta come out here. And she's like, no, we're dancing. I'm like, no, you're coming outside. She said, no, I'm not. I said, yes, you are. I'm like, this is the problem with family, right? If it was any bride, they'd follow you. But my sister's like, no. I'm like, yes. So we grab her and we take her outside. And here, if I didn't use flash, well, they would be gone, right? They would have been silhouetted amongst the hills and the trees and everything. They literally would be non-existent. So I fill flashed it. And what I did was, I went into manual mode with them out of the frame. And I said, if I were to shoot this right now, what does the camera think? And the camera goes, oh, to get a nice sky, I think we should be at this setting. And I go, all right, fine. So I go to manual mode and I tell the camera, go at this setting. And then I turn on my flash and I say, go at full power or maybe 3/4 power, whatever, and boom. And then I add flash to the image. So it's metered correctly for the sunset, and then I'm adding light to them. Okay? This is what I was telling you about the other day. I shot this last month, actually, where I set up multiple flashes on the DJs. They have those like the speaker stands. So I took one of the 600 series Canon flashes and I clamped it to it, and I just left it on for the whole night. So what the cool thing with the new flashes is I can hit a button on my flash on my camera and say, turn on that one or that one. And I can even control the power of the flash. So most of the time it wasn't on, but I knew as soon as they put the kids in the chair, I wanted to get a shot. So I went opposite of my flash, so it would be hair lighter. So I knew my flash was there. I'd get to the point where I couldn't see the flash, she'd be in the way, and I turned it on from my camera and fired it off. A little bit more intricate, but really fun to do. This one here, no flash. If I used a flash, it would have ruined this picture. I shot this in Hawaii, 400 millimeter lens, handheld. I used the light of the fire to light this guy. And again, if I use flash, it would lose all the emotion of the shot. So again, this is where you want to practice and learn where to use flash and where not to use a flash. And in this case, this one I did in an aquarium. It was a matter of, I knew I had to have flash to light them up, but I was trying to figure out how the heck to flash them without bouncing that light all over the glass. So I had to experiment with that and use a diffuser and figure it out. So there's times even I walk into an environment, this was a tricky one. Most environments I can walk into and in a split second go, yep, I'm gonna bounce off that wall or that ceiling or use a diffuser or two flashes, or this one here I walked in and said, oh God, I have no idea. So I went and I got there a couple of hours before the event started, because another kid's bat mitzvah. And what I did is I actually got some of the aquarium workers and I said, you're gonna stand right there. I just started firing shots and testing. This is my buddy Bob, and I shot him. He's actually holding the flash. I used this image on another presentation here, and someone on YouTube wrote in and says, there's no way he's holding the flash, trust me. He's just holding it like this, on a little softbox on a flash. So this one here, I shot in manual mode. This is in my living room during the day. And you're like, well, how is it pitch black if it's during the day? Well, I shot in manual mode, and I shot it like at 1,000th of a second, and so I let no light in. And then I had Bob hold this other flash, and we added light using the flash. A little bit more advanced, but just to show how you can control things with your camera. Here's a simple tip. Do you want your image stabilization on or off? 99% time, it might be on. But sometimes you don't want it on. Like I said, I love to do night photography. If I put a lot of camera lenses, or if I put my camera with some lenses on the tripod, it confuses the image stabilization. And the IS goes, things are awfully still here. Maybe I'll try to fix that. So when I shoot on a tripod, especially in my night shots, I turn off the IS. And it's called different things for different camera manufacturers, but any kind of stabilization you can turn off if you're on a tripod. Although if I'm on a monopod, shooting the Olympics, I actually leave it on sometimes. Depending on how much movement I'm gonna be interjecting, I may keep it on, I generally turn it off, even then. Here's another simple one, the beep. And hello. Oh, it's changing on me. I forgot there's an animated one, but you'll see here in a second. The beep. Where is it? There it is, beep. Know how to turn that off. Because there's nothing more annoying than the photographer who's in the back room and all he hears is beep, beep. So when I'm shooting portraits, actually, I like to leave it on. It's reassuring to me when I'm shooting to hear the beep, to know I'm locked in and the camera has focused. So I actually like it on. But when I'm shooting in a quiet environment, my God, turn it off, because it's really obnoxious. And here's a last one for you. And this is customize your favorite menu. How many people have done this? Nobody. Okay. On a lot of the cameras, they have a menu, and Canon's been doing it for a long time. They have a menu called My Menu. And you can customize when you go to it and you click and it says, would you like to add something to My Menu? And you say yes, and it gives you every option that's in the camera, and you can put your favorites on there. So I just shot this morning with my iPhone of my Menu, so I want to show you what I put up there. These are the things I use almost all the time. How many menus are in this camera? They're probably a couple hundred, and they're embedded amongst, themselves. They're hard to find. So for one, I usually shoot RAW. When I shoot a bar mitzvah, I always shoot the service RAW, and then I shoot the party in what's called MRAW, which is medium RAW, because I don't need 21 megapixel files. So I like that ability, and I also like to reassure myself immediately, am I in RAW? Yes. So that's number one. Number two, as I mentioned, is beep, because I want to be able to turn it off really quickly, because when the service starts, I'm shooting a wedding, and I look down and go, oh God, boom, turn it off quickly, because if I hear it, I don't want to make noise. Because a good photographer is one that you don't hear or see, in many cases. Highlight alert, that's our blinkies we talked about. I put it there because, again, when I'm showing a client, I want to be able to turn it off really quickly so I can turn around and show them what their images look like without that thing coming at them. Format card. I format every time I shoot. I reformat a card. Even if I do a test shot, this is how weird I am. If I do a test shot, I never like to delete images off a card. I like to just format and start over. And I always format in camera. So here's the way it works. I shoot an event, like the one I did last Saturday. All those cards are on my desk still at home. I don't bring those with me here, even though they're backed up in 2 spots. Once I do a remote backup and get them out of my house, I'll erase those cards and use them again. So what I do is I leave them with the images on them until I know that they've been backed up in numerous places. I put them in the camera. I then format from this menu and then go shoot. The external speedlight control is something that's, again, fairly new on these cameras, but this allows me to control all the settings of the flash without even using the flash. So I can do it from the camera menu, which is really cool. I just started playing with that more. The last one you see there is your settings for this menu, and that allows you to then add and subtract things from this menu. So it's really kind of a one-stop shop where 90% of my settings are. The other one that's highlighted is custom controls. That is my back focus on and off. And the reason it's highlighted is because that's one I use a lot. So I leave it rolled there. And so I'm turning that on and off 10, 20 times a day, sometimes, depending on what I'm shooting. And then, so here's the thing. If you guys have questions, I do answer every email. Sometimes it takes me a couple days, but I will answer emails. And a lot of people are using Facebook now to ask me stuff, and that works fine too.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.